Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Observer Research Foundation. Today's panel discussion will be focusing on the existing fog over the strategic and operational imperatives of the Balakot airstrikes. The reason why we're having this discussion today is the Indian establishment has not managed the narrative of this at the same tempo as the military operations. There's been a lot of pushback to demand that India needs to unveil proof of damage, casualties to prove its military capability. Also due to the timing, this has also become interlinked with the upcoming Indian elections. So this discussion essentially will seek to debate the deterrence value of these airstrikes, firstly, and how they will impact future operations against terrorist organizations in the region. Historically, the use of air power has been viewed as having an escalatory effect, case in point 1962, the Kargil conflict in 1999. And lastly, I would also like the panelists to touch upon the IAF's aging and accident-prone fleet and how this decline might affect future operations. So we have with us three eminent panelists, Air Vice Marshal Arjun Subramaniam, Dr. Manpreet Sethi, and Sandeep Unnayathan. Air Vice Marshal, would you like to kick off the discussions? 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll move to the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here at ORF this afternoon to share some strategic and operational perspective of the Balakot airstrikes and beyond. And I think we are in uncharted strategic territory as far as the application of air power is concerned, as far as certain established mechanisms of deterrence that we are used to within the Indian strategic establishment, and whether this has been something that has come up all of a sudden, or whether it has gradually evolved over the last few years, is something that I would probably touch upon. Now, the way I look at it is that this was something that has actually been gradually built up. And the environment that one faced in the backdrop of these strikes was, I would call that, or I would liken it to a pressure cooker kind of an environment. Okay? And the valve had to blow sometime or the other. Now, did the valve blow suddenly, or was it a gradual sort of testing of capability that fructified into this kind of an expression of the employment of air? Let's look at it this way. The strikes along the Myanmar border, I think, were the first expression of wanting to sort of change the paradigms of deterrence. And when I talk about changing the paradigms of deterrence, I'm not talking about any muscular shift. If I were to look at Indian deterrence over the years, I would tag it as sort of responsible and restrained, and probably some would call it as diffident. And all I would say is that these expressions of a slightly more punitive manifestation probably introduces one more R, and that is resolve. So, let's not get carried away and say that this is a muscular expression of changing paradigms of Indian deterrence. No, I don't think so. I think it's merely a demonstration of intent and resolve. And it's been built up gradually over the last 4 years. We first had shallow strikes against the NSC and K camps along both the Manipur and the Nagaland border. A couple of years later, we had shallow cross-border strikes along multiple axes into POK. Now, and then we had the Balakot strikes. What changed? Two things. One is, I remember as a squadron leader in the 1990s, I used to wonder, why have we not sort of articulated a more punitive policy of deterrence? Why hasn't a declaratory punitive policy come into place, particularly in the 90s? And I know many Northern Army commanders have asked for a declaratory punitive policy. But the declaratory punitive policy never came about. And that is what I call a manifestation of some element of diffidence on the part of the Indian strategic establishment, probably whether it was confidence, whether it was escalatory, whether it was this overarching need to be seen as a responsible and a restrained power. There are many manifestations of why possibly a punitive declaratory or a declaratory punitive policy didn't come into play. The punitive policy still has not been articulated. Now, What did that punitive policy, what would it have meant from an aviator's perspective? Now, for those of you who were in service at that time, you will recollect that probably POK was littered with terrorist training camps, and they presented good targets for air. But that option was never taken because of that perception that has constantly prevailed within the Indian strategic establishment: air power is escalatory, air power is escalatory. I have argued since the time I was, maybe a wing commander, to say that yes, air power may be temporarily escalatory, but it also has a de-escalatory component. Look at what happened in Kargil. Air power, the moment air power was introduced, I'm not saying it was a game changer, but I would reckon that the conflict, we could force conflict termination at least a couple of weeks earlier than what it would have been had air power not been introduced. And that, to my mind, is a classic example of the de-escalatory potential of air power. And yet, following the 2008 attacks, it's come out in the press that the Indian Air Force had options, but then I guess the strategic establishment was not willing to bite. And that is why we decided to continue with the policy of sort of restrained and responsible deterrence until one after another the pressure cooker environment, like I told you, started building up. So that's the big picture. Not any great muscular manifestation or change in deterrence. It is just a little more resolute and sort of, I would say, determined. Now let's come to Balakot per se. What was different about Balakot? What was different about Balakot was that the Indian Air Force managed to demonstrate capability that it has been building and exercising for over decades, which is precision delivery, which is intelligence-based targeting, because in modern aerial warfare, all targeting is intelligence and all intelligence is targeting. So that was what Balakot was all about. It was an intelligence-driven operation. It was a precision-based operation. And I wonder whether any one of you has sort of given it a thought that the aerial engagement the following day was probably the largest aerial engagement in a less than war situation in the post-World War II era. Mark my words, less than war situation. It was a 20 aircraft plus package of the Pakistani Air Force, well configured package, and the Indian Air Force always has a fair amount of has always had a fair amount of respect for the professional capability of the Pakistan Air Force. It wasn't going to be a cakewalk. The Indian response was equally resolute. And I was explaining to somebody over tea that an air defense response will never be matched in contemporary aerial warfare with exactly the same numbers. And that's exactly what happened on the 27th. That a large package was met with a smaller element of Indian multi-role combat aircraft. I think it was well orchestrated. And the operational objectives of the entire mission was probably achieved. Now, I was telling Sushant also, you can look at this entire operation as a glass half full or as a glass half empty. Well, I will go along with that. If you look at it as a glass that was half full, yes, there hasn't been an instance before wherein the Indian Air Force has responded to surprise with resilience and with this kind of a pushback. We were surprised in 1965, we were surprised in 1971 with the preemptive strikes, but of course those days air defense networks were pretty basic, and the attacker always got away. That was the paradigm of air warfare. You had surprise on your side and you got away with a preemptive operation. In today's aerial environment, if you have a robust air defense network, which India does have, all preemptive surprise-led missions do not get away. And that's exactly what was demonstrated. You had a bunch of Mirage 2000 Sukhois and Bisons sort of pushing back a package. And again, I will not be muscular and embark on any kind of chest thumping. This is not about a MiG-21 and an F-16. This is more about situational awareness. It's about another lesson to be taken away is that in an era where everybody says it's only beyond visual range combat, we still have a window for close combat. We still have a window for what they call what we pilots call eyeball Mark 1. And the eyeball Mark 1 is the eye, which spots an adversary in the air and then continues in an aerial engagement. We still have space for high quality ground-based controlling. We have space for high quality AWACS-borne controlling. So I would say one more element of the glass being half full is the fact that there was good teamwork. That resulted in the end outcomes of the aerial engagement. So, what are the challenges I see in a post Balakot kind of a scenario? One is, if this entire process of application of air power in a less than war situation, in what I would term as initially a counter-terrorist operation and thereafter a classic aerial pushback, is there space for further employment of air? The answer is yes, and the answer is no. Yes, if there is clear-cut intelligence available. Yes, if the operation is driven by hardened. Yes, if the operation can be accompanied with nil or low collateral damage. And if there is, if discrimination is possible. No, if all the above are not available. So I think in terms of biting the bullet, yes. For me as an aviator, it's uncharted territory. But it's not that these ideas were not existing. From 2012 onwards, the Air Force has been doctrinally talking about subconventional warfare. Most of these exercises, Gagan Shakti and the others, have had elements of subcon sort of manifestation. So it's not that the Air Force was not ready for subconventional operations. It's just that everything to come together did take a little while. Does the application of air power demonstrate political resolve? It does. Does the application of air power demonstrate inter-service synergy? It does. You will ask me how. Because let me assure you that the Indian Air Force would not have launched its aerial strikes unless the other services were ready for escalation. So I would say that the airstrikes also indicate a significant steps forward in jointmanship and synergy. Challenges, of course the Air Force has numerous challenges to face. Pushan mentioned, yes, the Air Force has very wide inventories. It has a dwindling fighter fleet. Well, everything's being done in order to address those deficiencies, but it takes time. And that's why the acquisition of the Rafale and the 110 follow-on fighters and fully suited the Tejas is as essential. Because if you look at it, any Air Force cannot have all top-end cutting-edge platforms. You have to have cutting-edge platforms, you will have higher-end platforms, and you will have workhorse platforms. So that's one. The second challenge for the Indian Air Force is how does one doctrinally take this forward? So I'm sure this will be brainstormed in the days ahead, and it's something to sort of track closely. Challenges overall, will these airstrikes in any way inhibit any further terror strikes? Of course not. Okay. What does this mean? This also means that probably Indian society has to, the hardening of Indian society is imperative in order to brace yourself for a backlash. When will the backlash come? One never knows. That's the dilemma of contemporary conflict, and no single incident will be the same as before. And that's the challenge again for established air forces to remain ready, for joint operational mechanisms to sort of sharpen their edge. And finally, is this, and I will end from where I started, is this a muscular shift? No, I don't think it's a muscular shift. It is merely a morphing of capabilities into something actionable. Okay, right. I think I'm under time. I think I've said what I have to say, and we'll take on questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Air Vice Marshal. Dr. Sethi, would you like to take the conversation forward?
Thank you very much. Uh, Thank you, Pushan, and thank you, ORF, for having me here to share my thoughts on a subject on which I think each one of us sitting here has something to say. It's a very timely discussion to be having on the strategic and operational perspectives of the Balakot airstrikes. And I have broadly put my thoughts into 6 large baskets. Largely in terms of answering certain questions that I raised to myself. So the first question that I ask is, why did Balakot happen? And the reason I'm asking this question is because we need to frame this debate correctly. We often tend to think about it only in terms of post-Balakot. You know, when I was at a conference just a month ago in Washington, D.C., the Carnegie Conference, and they hurriedly put together a session on South Asia because they were not planning to have a session on South Asia this time. But after what happened in February, they decided to have a session on South Asia, and the entire focus of that debate was on post-Balakot. But I think we need to understand why Balakot happens. And the reason Balakot happens is because of Pulwama. So the focus has to be on Pulwama and not on Balakot. The situation is post-Pulwama and not post-Balakot. And the reason I'm saying this is because at least in India, we need to frame this debate correctly. The onus of creating this situation lies on Pakistan, and they must squarely be blamed for having brought us to this pass. So it's not about what are the escalation dynamics post-Balakot or what are the chances of risks and dangers that are growing because of the airstrikes that India did for the first time in so many years, etc., etc. But the fact is that there is an incident that happened before Balakot that led to Balakot. And if we can frame this debate correctly, I think it's important to keep that onus of the blame on the country, which has been, foisting these attacks on us for such a long period of time. And that's why my first point is about the framing of this debate. The second question then is, why do Pulwamas keep happening? And I think we all do understand the reasons for that. We all understand that terrorism, the use of terrorism as an instrument of foreign policy, is a very low-cost strategy for Pakistan. There is an easy and abundant flow of people who can be indoctrinated to carry out acts of terrorism. They don't need to spend much on training. In fact, there are reports to suggest that the training given to these people is nothing more than perhaps 2 weeks to 8 weeks maximum, depending on the intensity of the operation that they are being asked to carry out in India. So there is a steady stream available of terrorists. And from the time that Pakistan acquired its nuclear weapons, it also seems to believe that it has a sense of immunity from any conventional response from India. So it becomes a strategy that can be carried out carte blanche on the acts of terrorism without having to worry about the response. If Pakistan has been looking for parity with India for such a long period of time, it's with the acquisition of nuclear weapons that they find that sense of parity, because they've managed to negate the conventional superiority that India has. And therefore, the feeling that the conventional response from India cannot happen because of the risk of escalation. And that's why the focus also to get the international community to completely come into the picture, to start talking about the ramifications of what will happen in terms of escalation. So Pakistan's nuclear strategy, which is based on projecting a low nuclear threshold and a high nuclear noise, is meant both to deter India and to attract international attention. And this sense of immunity lets Pulwama-like events keep on happening in the course of time. So the third question then is, what are India's response options? Traditionally, I think India has largely been taking defensive measures. So it's better border fencing, better intelligence, better interception, taking them to the court of law, legal aspects that come into the picture. All of those dimensions are largely what India has been focused on from, say, 1998 till about 2008. The second type of action that India can take is covert action. And the best, I think, way of taking covert action is to let it be covert and not talk so much about it. The third would be economic diplomatic offensives. And post-2008, we saw India put a lot of focus on this dimension, where economic isolationism as well as diplomatic isolation of Pakistan was what India had been trying to carry out. And fortunately for us, during this period of time, from 2008, the Mumbai attack, to today, 10 years down the line, the international climate has changed enough for people to point that finger to Pakistan. I remember in our earlier sessions when we used to have on these issues, the general tendency was the moment India would start talking about terrorism from Pakistan, there would be a glazed look on the eyes of people to say that this is India, they will always talk like this. But today it's no longer the situation. People do understand that the hotbed of terrorism is Pakistan. And as a result of that, the economic, diplomatic dimension of what India has been trying to do with Pakistan has far more weight today than it had in the past. And because of this change in the international environment, I think India could do what it did in the case of the surgical strikes in 2016 and now in Balakot in 2018. So the last kind of action that India can take is a military offensive. As was pointed out by the AVM, we have been deterred from taking that because of the risk of escalation. And it's to the credit of the Pakistani narrative to build up that risk of escalation to such a high level that using any kind of force was seen as escalatory, whether it was air power or anything else. It was just seen that it would lead to some kind of escalation. So if these were the 4 kinds of actions that India can take, I quite agree with the way the AVM has framed it to say that we've shown far greater resolve in the kind of actions that have been taken in these times than we've done in the past. Now, my 4th question is, what is the strategic significance of Balakot? And I don't think it lies in the number of casualties that have been debated about. Whether it was 2 or 20 or 200, I don't think that really matters, because these are numbers of terrorists which can be replaced very quickly. So it's not in terms of the casualties that India caused, the debris that was created on ground, which is important. I think what is important is what India has managed to do in terms of breaching the mind space of both Pakistan and of India as well. So in conjunction with the surgical strikes of earlier in 2016 and with what we've done in Balakot, I think we've managed to demonstrate a menu of options at the military level which are possible that India can take. Actions to punish Pakistan for its use of terrorism, and the cost of that action, which will continue to be imposed on Pakistan every time such terrorism takes place. We've also managed to show the use of air power, which is not just in POK, because in most of the war games that all of us have played at track 2 levels, the general tendency has been to believe and delude ourselves into believing that if action was only in POK, then it would not be escalatory. Or if it was on ground, it would not be escalatory. Air power will be escalatory. I think both of those myths have been busted. And the projection of a low threshold by Pakistan to say that the moment you step into my territory or you do something, I have no other option but to use my nuclear trigger, that myth has been busted too. So there are limits to the brinksmanship strategy that Pakistan can continue to play. It's exposed that the Pakistani nuclear threshold is not as low as they make it out to be and get the world to believe it to be. Within this question, I think Balakot also turned the tables for Pakistan on 2 dimensions. For such a long time, they are the ones who've been saying that India is in a pincer where you've got nuclear weapons at the higher level and you've got subconventional conflict here, and they were compressing the space for the use of conventional power. So it was India which was being put into that pincer. I think in 2 ways, with the execution of the Balakot airstrikes, India has managed to turn the tables and put the pincer on Pakistan. The first is the dilemma of nuclear signaling that we saw Pakistan, face. Here was Pakistan, which likes to talk about a low nuclear threshold, not even mentioning the nuclear word. They were not, that's the dilemma that they were in, that with the criticism coming to them for the act of terrorism, did they want to bring in more negative dimensions by also mentioning nuclear, because everybody sees that as irresponsible behavior. So therefore, there was this pincer movement that happened in the case of Pakistan. And in contrast to this, India was able to reap the benefits of manipulation of risk, something that Pakistan has been doing for so long. They are the ones who've been manipulating the risk of escalation. And here, this time, it was India which carried out these airstrikes. also announced that its other instruments were on readiness, and also that the nuclear assets of India were in some state of readiness, or they were being put into some state of readiness. So that's why I said the tables were turned this time in terms of manipulation of risk. And the second pincer, I think, that Pakistan was squeezed into was by India's diplomatic actions and the military efforts, leading to economic consequences at home. So Pakistan is facing a very high level of economic consequence as a result of what has happened. Whether it's, people can laugh away at the fact that India imposed 200% import duty because there isn't very much that comes from Pakistan, but nevertheless it's a cost. And it gives a signal to others. Similarly, FATF blacklisting, which is a sword of Damocles which is hanging on Pakistan. Prices of food, availability of oil. There are reports of all kinds that are coming from Pakistan to suggest how much is the economic consequence of what they're facing as a result of the Balakot airstrikes. So my fifth question then is, can this stop Pakistan's use of terrorism? Certainly not. I mean, I completely agree with him. And as we said earlier, it's a low-cost strategy. They are not likely to give it up. So we have to brace ourselves for more Pulwama-like attacks to happen in the future. So what is there in the future then? And there are 4 or 5 points that I want to make on how India needs to brace itself and do some things in order to deter and to face up to what happens in the future. Firstly, equip the Indian armed forces with the right instruments to enable a calibrated use of force. We've been saying this for such a long period of time. The use of force, the way it could happen in the past, is unlikely to happen in the future. So it will be less than warlike situations, no declaration of wars happening, but nevertheless the use of force happening. So you need to have the right instruments, and therefore the equipping of special forces, the use of air power with the right kind of instruments that are necessary in order to use that air power in a calibrated fashion. All of that is extremely important. So we'll see less and less of tank battles and more of the kinds of instruments that we've seen now. I'm not saying conventional modernization of the armies must not happen, but we need to focus some of that investment in the right kinds of instruments in order to carry out the kind of strikes that we foresee in the future. Secondly, accord a very high importance to intelligence. We've seen what kind of an operation this was, largely because you could intelligently pick out the targets, and this was enabled by the presence of that intelligence. So therefore, a high investment in intelligence at all kinds of levels, including human, is going to be extremely important. Thirdly, we need to impose opportunity-based costs as and when they become available, to chip away at the credibility of the Pakistani armed forces. So it's not about casualties, it's about chipping away at the credibility of the Pakistani armed forces, because they are the ones who are holding up this entire structure of the terrorist organizations. The need is to dent the image of the Pakistani military. So with the surgical strikes in 2016, we managed to do that to the Pakistani army to some extent. With the airstrikes, it's managed to do that to the Pakistani Air Force. And wherever those opportunities exist, to keep on chipping away at that credibility, I think is extremely important. Keep the pressure at the LOC, because what they are losing in terms of attrition at the ammunition as well as the men level at the LOC is far more difficult to replace than the terrorists. So therefore, that pressure, I think, needs to continue. And 2 things that we need to do for ourselves at home. One is encourage responsible media behavior, because the media can sometimes run away with the story. I'm sorry to say that with so many media people here, but we did see the risks that existed by painting ourselves into corners which we will find difficult to get out of. So therefore, the importance of understanding the role of media in a situation like this, when you've got so many platforms. In fact, even before, the moment the strikes happened, we could see that war playing out on Twitter. How much of everyone was in that breaking news mode, not just the journalists, but every individual wanted to be the first to say something on a particular situation, which can sometimes have a domino effect of its own. And lastly, set our own house in order in Kashmir. Why do we provide troubled waters? Because the adversary is going to like to fish in those troubled waters. So therefore, the onus is on us to try and create as much of peace and calm as is possible. Some wrong kind of actions were taken across India after what happened in Pulwama, and those are completely not necessary, I think. India is a fragile nation, and we must respect it for its diversity and take all kinds of measures to strengthen our own hands rather than pull them down. So I'll stop here. Thank you so much, everyone.
Dr. Sethi, Sandeep, over to you. I think you already have a lot to answer from where Dr. Sethi left off.
Well, thanks, Pushan. Thank you, ORF, for having me over. I wonder how many of you have seen this movie called 300, this Hollywood film that came out a couple of years back. Now, there's a very interesting line of dialogue in that where the Persian envoy tells the Spartans that, our arrows will blot out the sun. And the Spartan replies, then we'll fight in the shade. And this is exactly what we've been seeing in the subcontinent for the last 30 years. And this is something that began in 1990 when Pakistan acquired nuclear weapons. It has been fighting in the shade of its nuclear weapons. This has led to what Commodore Uday Bhaskar said a couple of years back, NWET, nuclear weapons enabled terrorism. In short, the impolite version of this is nuclear blackmail. And I just want to go back to 1990 because I feel this is when it all began, and it'll help us better understand why Pulwama and Balakot are so important. Now, of course, covert warfare and non-state actors, guerrillas, are not alien to the subcontinent. In fact, they have been an aspect of every single Indo-Pakistan war since 1947. So in 1947-48, you had the raiders who were led by the Pakistan Army that attacked Jammu and Kashmir. In 65, you had special forces disguised as raiders, the Pakistani special forces, of course. In 71, for the first time, you had India training, arming, equipping, and supporting the Mukti Bahini in East Pakistan, which later became Bangladesh. And right down to 1999, where you had the so-called Mujahideen who had occupied the Kargil Heights, which, as we now know, were the Northern Light Infantry. So now this covert warfare assumes a new dimension in 1990 when the Soviet Union withdraws from Afghanistan. And this is roughly the time when Pakistan gets two very significant strategic capabilities. The first one is what the Indian government calls the infrastructure of terror, which is nothing but a very large, it's a huge infrastructure which has the ability to train large numbers of young people to fight a proxy war, train, equip, and send them across, like Manpreet was saying a little earlier. There are, of course, thousands of veterans of the Afghan war that are around. There's a lot of weapons left over from this Afghan war to push across the border. And this also coincides in 1989-90 with a very massive Pakistan Army exercise called Zarb-e-Momin, which actually signals the fact that Pakistan is ready for a conventional war with India after many years, after 71. This Zarb-e-Momin spills over into what is called the South Asian nuclear crisis of 1990, where the United States is forced to intervene in what it sees is a potential nuclear flashpoint between two nuclear-armed countries. Of course, then the bombs are still in the basement, but still this actually creates this myth of a nuclear-armed, nuclear flashpoint in South Asia, and that's one of the first of many watersheds that are to follow. And this nuclear deterrence allows Pakistan to pursue what it calls a war of 1,000 cuts. And these two very significant capabilities, non-state actors and nuclear weapons, go hand in hand. And it emboldens the deep state to embark on a very, what we would call a very reckless policy of, a subconventional war against India. It in fact even emboldens the deep state to launch for the first time attacks on the Indian mainland. And you have 3 very high visibility attacks in Mumbai between 1993 and 2008. 3 attacks over a span of 15 years, neither of whose methods are similar, but the effect is the same. The objective is the same. It is to paralyze India's economic nerve center. Now, it starts with 1993, the serial blasts in Mumbai, where you have RDX that's manufactured in Pakistani ordnance factories, which are shipped over to India in the same cartons that they were manufactured in. I mean, that is the level of brazenness. And these blasts result in the deaths of over 250 Indians, but there is no response. And I'll come to that a little later. But the closest that these non-state actors come to triggering of the tripwire of a conventional war between India and Pakistan is in 2001, when you have the Jaish-e-Mohammed that attacks Parliament on the 13th of December. If you look at the casualty count, it's not just 7 people died. Unfortunately, the terrorists don't break into the Parliament. But in terms of symbolism, this is a very, very high symbolic attack. It's a high visibility attack. The symbol of Indian democracy is attacked, the Parliament, and India goes in for Operation Parakram, which is this 10-month-long mobilization of all the armed forces along the border with Pakistan. And this results in a promise of good behavior from General Musharraf, which he says that Pakistani territory will not be used for pursuing action against India. But of course, this is one of the first promises he breaks, not very far into the future. But 2001 is again another watershed because it signals the fact that non-state actors like the Jaish have the potential for triggering off a conventional war between India and Pakistan. And it's also a test of the fact that Pakistan's nuclear weapons are essentially political weapons. I mean, all nuclear weapons are political weapons, but more so in our case because Pakistan's nuclear weapons are aimed at the Indian political leadership. It's to signal to them that they have no other option when you're faced with Pakistan's nuclear weapons, and it kind of constricts their ability to take a decision in a crisis like a parliamentary attack. And even at the height of this attack, or this mobilization Parakram, you had an incident, the Kaluchak massacre on the 14th of May 2002, where 31 army, where men, women, children, all from army families were attacked and killed. But even at this outrageous attack, there is no response from the Indian government. The deployment continues, and in 10 months, Parakram is over. And then in 2006, you have 7 very well orchestrated terror attacks on trains in Mumbai, moving commuter trains. And 202 passengers are killed. And in, of course, 2008, you have 166 Indians and foreigners killed in Mumbai by 10 terrorists who we now know came from Pakistan. None of these attacks invite any conventional military retaliation. And from what we understand, the discussions in the government at that time seem to suggest that there was a sort of a self-imposed moratorium on the use of the military option. I mean, Parakram, of course, is a little more complicated because when there was a window for retaliation, the military was not ready. It took 3 weeks, 4 weeks to mobilize. But in 2611, we know for a fact that the military option was examined. The Air Force Chief, in fact, was asked for options. He asked for targeting data of camps. He wanted the precise location of terror training camps in POK, and he wanted people on the ground to lace those targets so his aircraft could go and hit them. Unfortunately, none of this was available, and the military option was discarded. And the government of the day, in its wisdom, chose to use the diplomatic option to pressurize Pakistan, and that option was abandoned. Now, post 2611, there's a pause in proxy war. We don't know exactly what's going on across the border in Pakistan, but one of the options, one of the things that's going on there is the fact that there is this huge internal war that the Pakistan army is fighting with the TTP. And for the first time, you have suicide attacks across the heartland of Pakistan. And this is also the time when the Pak military is working on its own counter cold start doctrine, which is to deter the Indian cold start response, which would come to a outrage like a parliament attack or something, a very rapid military mobilization that would go in and grab territory or inflict damage in weeks and hours, if not days. So this counter cold start strategy starts to take shape in about 2011 or 12, and this is one of the main factors of this is the fact that they deploy for the first time the Nasser, which is basically a battlefield nuclear weapon. The use of tactical nuclear weapons is introduced. Tactical nuclear weapons are introduced in South Asia just the way they were in Western Europe of the Cold War 60s and the 70s. And then you see a lot more confidence in the deep state, that the fact that they have managed to also deter even a cold start kind of rapid response under a nuclear overhang. And then the terror attacks start to begin in 2013 and 14. You have these two very sensational attacks first in Gurdaspur in 2015, and then you have another one in Pathankot at the airbase. Both of these attacks I call them failed attacks because they failed to achieve their objectives. In the case of Gurdaspur, they had planned to blow up a commuter train, and the casualties would have been horrific. Fortunately, the bombs were discovered. And in the case of the Pathankot airbase, the terrorists were stopped from reaching their intended targets, which were the parked military aircraft. Now, things begin to change in 2016 after the attack on the Uri camp, which kills 18 soldiers. It leads to cross-border raids by Indian special forces on terrorist launch pads. These kind of raids have been done in the past by the Indian special forces, but not to the extent that they were in 2016. And the most important departure, what we saw was the fact that this was for the first time openly claimed by the Indian Army. There was politico-military signaling of the highest order. The DGMO appeared on television to signal the fact that, yes, we had gone across and carried out strikes, and a de-escalation had begun immediately after that. Now, Pulwama. Now, we know the immediate provocation for Balakot, which is the Pulwama terror attack, which a suicide bomber. And it's the first time that suicide bombing had been used in this particular way in the valley after almost 20 years. It was an attack that was designed to cause very high casualties. And while the attempt was made to show that this was more of a local attack, as in the attacker was a local youth, there is enough evidence to suggest that most of the expertise for this came from across the border. And sure enough, you had the Jaish-e-Mohammed based in Pakistan claiming credit for it. Its spokesperson actually calls up the press based in Pakistan to claim credit for the attack. And there is a 20-minute video of the suicide bomber, explaining why he did it. And so on the 26th, India crosses this self-imposed moratorium, its own Lakshman Rekha, if you could call it, to launch attacks on mainland Pakistan, the first time since 1971. And the experts will bear me out if I say that this is possibly the first time that the Air Force had been used by a nuclear-armed country to attack another nuclear-armed country. So this is the kind of high-level signaling that the government has done with this February 26th attack. And what the Foreign Secretary says is very significant, as in he calls it a preemptive non-military strike. So this is another departure from convention. So the other major internal dimension of Pulwama is the fact that it's actually managed to take away the narrative from what the government of the day was battling against in February of 2019, this year, that you had this whole narrative of jobs and economy and rural distress, and now suddenly the discourse has completely changed towards national security. And of course, the other impact of the other fallout of Balakot is likely to be the fact that the Air Force will get its share of resources and much more attention, and the fact, like AVM Subramaniam mentioned, the fact that the Air Force can be used as an instrument of as a tool of the government for tackling subconventional threats. Now, the important thing to note is whether Balakot, the airstrike, actually represents a departure from our previous responses to terrorism. Is it just a foot in the door, or is it a complete change in our mindset when it comes to cross-border terrorism? Now, the jury is out on that, but I think the biggest strategic fallout of this is the fact that the main item on the menu that India has served on the 26th of February is unpredictability. This is something that we had been at the receiving end for the last 30 years, this factor of unpredictability. we've taken that initiative away from Pakistan, and now the Indian state is completely unpredictable. You never know when the next attack is going to come, what form it's going to take, what shape it's going to take, whether it's going to be land, sea, or air. Now, is this going to be a permanent feature? Is it an institutional-led response? I'm not very sure. But I see the responses to Uri and Balakot as being personality-driven. And I'll tell you why. I mean, look at the personality of the Prime Minister. We all know what he's like, unafraid to take big risks. And also the National Security Advisor. Now, in this context, I want to cite this interview that I read of Mr. Doval in 2006, after the Mumbai train bombings, where he gave this interview to Outlook magazine, where he says these things, that Pakistan considers covert action as an effective, sustainable instrument to achieve its politico-strategic objectives. It will not abandon this this policy unless forced to. A situation has to be created so that Pakistan cannot afford to continue with terrorism. In the defensive mode, no security system can provide 24/7 protection to 1 billion people against trained terrorists. A shift from defensive defense to offensive defense, both externally and internally, is needed. It will have to be a major political decision. Now, I mean, in the absence of other information about what was going on in the government at this point, I think these are very, very significant words. And this fact of offensive defense kind of captures what we've been seeing on the subcontinent for the last 3 years, at least since Uri. And while I don't know if this political decision that the NSA spoke of has been taken, the evidence on the ground after Uri and after Pulwama seems to suggest that there has been a sea shift in the way the government of India sees cross-border terrorism. Has all of this been enshrined in a doctrine, in a national security doctrine? We don't know yet. We know for a fact that there is a national security doctrine that's in the works, and it's not been released yet. But will episodes like Pulwama now trigger off a retaliatory conventional attack of this kind? I mean, is it an assured fact now from now on that every action like a high visibility attack like Pulwama is going to invite a conventional military attack? We don't know. What will be the Pakistani military deep state's response to these kind of attacks? Will they try and wrest the initiative of unpredictability away from us? We don't know yet. But as the old newspaper cliche goes, only time will tell. Thank you.
Thanks, Sandeep. I'm going to use my prerogative as the chair to ask all three of you the first round of questions, and then maybe we can open our up to the floor. Dr. Sethi, you mentioned the dilemma of nuclear signaling, manipulation of risk, but there was some sort of nuclear signaling. If you look at after the first the airstrikes, Imran Khan's press conferences did mention nuclear weapons indirectly, and how we could go down that escalation. So that was some sort of signal that let's not go down this route anymore. And the second thing is manipulation of risk. While we have also proven intent to a certain extent that the next time such an attack happens, we will strike you not just in Pakistan occupied Kashmir but also in Pakistan. But they have also shown certain amount of resolve that they will also strike back, or at least try to strike back. So how do you think that goes into that whole framework of the escalatory ladder risk? And my next question, the first one is for you. Is you mentioned the modernization of the Air Force is work in progress. Of course it is. It's been slower than some of us have wanted it to be. But you also mentioned that we're talking about subcontinent with nuclear armed states. Do you really foresee a full-scale conventional war where we will need 42 squadrons to deter Pakistan, China, so on and so forth? And if not, do we need to start thinking of force structures which are more suitable to surgical strikes like this across the border versus having large force-on-force conflicts? And the second question, which is to both of you, and Sandeep more so because he's on the media, do you think somewhere down this line in these airstrikes we have lost out on the information warfare part of this whole thing? During Kargil we were showing videos of lasing Tiger Hill, so on and so forth, to control the narrative that was coming out. After these airstrikes, there has been nothing, and which have obviously rightly so raised questions on the efficacy of these strikes. So, are the armed forces beyond question? Do they have to maintain some sort of semblance of transparency to control the narrative? Thank you.
You asked about modernization. Now, let's not lose sight of the big picture by zeroing in on this figure of 42. Okay, if one looks at it practically, we are down to about 30. We are down to about 30 squadrons. We will be down to a little more before the build-up starts taking place. Will we ever reach 42? I don't know. And given the pace at which things are going, highly unlikely. Will somewhere down the line somebody cap it based on the changing paradigms of conflict? You never know. But the fact is, you also asked about conflict. Yeah, I don't think the days are not completely gone as far as force on force engagements are concerned. But certainly not across multiple fronts. What we are primarily looking at are limited, high intensity conflicts of the Kargil kinds in different kind of terrain. But as long as a conventional threat exists both on the western and the northern front, I think one can't wish away the possibility of building forces for conventional capability. That's what Manpreet also mentioned, and I go along with that. Okay. The second is you asked about the battle of narratives. Okay. In one of my pieces a few days ago, I've clearly mentioned that I don't think the Indian strategic establishment managed the narrative as well as it managed the actual operation. And we've also seen that the management of the narrative probably is as important as management of the operation in conventional conflict. But having said that, unlike the Kargil conflict or the Gulf War, which was practically declared war, wherein you could afford to make statements, you could afford to sort of put out videos into the open and things like that, this was not war. This was a less than war situation, which was in an area of grey. It was uncharted strategic territory for the Indian strategic establishment also. So let's not pillory the establishment for not managing the narrative. I would much rather manage the narrative badly than to have managed the operation badly. Okay, so that's where I stand on this. I repeat myself. I would much rather have managed the narrative badly than have managed the operation badly. Secondly, if one looks at the narrative from a position of strength, the onus is not on India to decide or to put the cards on the table. Okay, the airstrikes were conducted to sort of force a certain behavioral change. That only time will tell. And I will, again, staying with the narrative. Okay, one knows the reason why the narrative is a little obfuscated. It's because of technology. It's because of the inability to sort of declassify satellite imagery. It's also a function of the accuracy of the weapon, the lack of widespread destructive capability of the weapon, but its pinpoint accuracy and its subsequent impact within the target system. The onus is on the Pakistani establishment to prove that the strike hasn't taken place. It's not the onus is not so much on India to prove that the strike has been effective. The onus is on the Pakistani establishment. So why is it that the two buildings that were targeted, mainly there were actually 4 targeted, or finally it was zeroed into 2. Why have those 2 buildings not 1 month later? Why hasn't it been open to call the media? Call them, say that, look, this was the building that was targeted. This is the building that images are available. There's nothing happened over here. But no, 1 month down the line, that hasn't happened. So that's my take on this.
So on the two questions that you asked me, one on dilemma of nuclear signaling. From what Sandeep said, and I've been mentioning, Pakistan's nuclear strategy is to keep nuclear weapons in our face all the time. They don't let us forget that they have nuclear weapons. So even when Myanmar happened, it was Pakistan that was standing up and saying, you can't do this to us because we've got nuclear weapons. So that's the kind of nuclear signaling that they normally do. You are right. After Balakot, the political council or the National Command Authority of Pakistan did meet. There was, that was put out into the papers. And also, Prime Minister Imran Khan, of course, mentioned that both of us have certain kinds of weapons, and we both understand what could be the risks when we have those kinds of weapons. But the point I'm making is, unlike in the past, they did not mention the word nuclear, and that's where I find their dilemma. Because on the one hand, they wanted to make sure that the other side understands that nuclear weapons can come into play, because that's their strategy. But on the other hand, they also wanted to project themselves as a responsible player. So having led to this situation, they were then trying to control the effects of that to the extent they could by not mentioning nuclear. In fact, if you see some of the writings which have appeared of their scholars in the last month in the newspapers, Dawn, Nation, everywhere, they are the ones who are pointing out to the fact that it was India which was putting its nuclear assets on alert, whereas we did not do anything of the kind, compared to what happened earlier when Nawaz Sharif was, brought to the US to say that your nuclear assets are on alert, and he said that I didn't know about it. So that's where I find this dilemma creeping into their behavior. Manipulation of risk, I think generally the onus of mature behavior, of responsibility has been on India. That's how the Western world tells us. These are irrational people. They will behave the way they do. They will carry out provocations. You are the ones who should not be provoked. But at this time, I think India managed to manipulate that risk in order to show to the world that there is only that much space that Pakistan can use for its brinksmanship strategy. And lastly, on this question of information warfare that you raised, I think the AVMs answered it very well. But managing narrative in times like today, when there are so many media platforms, social platforms, is extremely difficult. So we've seen if Kargil was a unidimensional war in terms of only having the TV intruding into what was happening at Kargil, this time you had everybody acting like that. So this was the first crisis or action which has really played out in the age of Twitter, where everybody was contributing to the creation or the de-escalation of that crisis. So therefore, managing narratives in times like this is going to be extremely difficult, and this will have to be carefully thought through, which is why I mentioned this particularly as one of the future actions that we will need to get our hands on.
I just thought I'd mention one more issue. If you notice one thing, in the entire management of the narrative, the Indian strategic establishment did not put its foot in its mouth even once. Whereas, as against that, you look at the ISPR narrative, which is so-called managed very much better during this crisis. No. The number of times General Ghafoor said something and then said something contradictory, 2 pilots, 3 pilots, F-16, no F-16, AMRAAM, no AMRAAM. Now that was high optic management of the narrative, but certainly not effective. Now, if the Anglo-Saxon media falls hook, line and sinker for that narrative, so be it.
Sethi?
Yeah, Bhushan, I actually second what Dr. Manpreet said about this, the fact that the narrative was not managed very well, and I have friends here who cover defense in South Block, and between the 26th and the 27th of February, there were long pauses, long periods of silence when we actually wanted clarity, and a lot of the news was coming from the other side. I mean, as in the fact that it was the DG ISPR who broke the news of Indian jets crossing the line of control and dropping ordnance, and so we were getting a lot of news from across the border, and when we turned here, there was very little clarity. So I agree with what Manpreet said, the fact that when you want to manage narratives, I mean, communication is very, very important, and this is the Indian military that kind of perfected this not so long ago. In Kargil, 20 years back, you had an absolutely fantastic media response, and in fact that was the first media war that was fought, and 20 years later you have a thing of everybody looking around the room and not really answering your questions and creating a very large vacuum for the other side to fill. So that's my point. I think the narrative could have been managed much better. The media strategy should have been handled much better. We have a cold start strategy for war fighting, but we don't seem to have a cold start strategy when it comes to handling the media.
Thanks, Sandeep. So what we'll do is we'll take 3 or 4 questions and then come back to the panelists for their comments. I would request you to keep your questions as short as possible, less than a minute, please. I'll just come to you, sir. Angad, do you want to go first?
I'll go on from what Sandeep said about Kargil. The worry isn't so much as the fact that they, we'd rather they handle the operation better than the media management. The worry is that 20 years on, have we gotten worse at media management? That's the issue, not the fact that the operation was good and the media management was bad. And secondly, we're all sort of votaries of air power here, and we've just spoken about boosting the Air Force's capabilities, resource allocation, and so on. The narrative plays a huge role in shaping the Air Force's credibility, both in the eyes of the public, who are the voters, and the politicians, who will eventually decide who gets what share of the pie. So if the Air Force's credibility is in question because of bad narrative management, that is a fundamental problem.
Sir?
By Navy, but it was an Air Force operation. I wouldn't have asked this question because so much has been labored on the narrative, and I think I agree with him. I think a change has come. A big article has come out to explain how the aircraft took off from to 6 aircraft, Mirage to Adampur, got spice ready, got the bombs ready, got everything ready. 6 took off on the day, early morning from Gwalior, came overhead in Agra, got refueled, entered the civilian corridor to lure the cap of Pakistan, and then used terrain mapping, Pegasus, all the technology that you have talked about. So I think little late in the day to glorify what we could do and we can do for the future. Whether we use it or not, you've been discussing it'll happen or not. But therefore it has done that. So my question to you is, since you mentioned the other thing, that this was the first time below war 20 aircraft of Pakistan Air Force went up. What do we know about that? Was their target Adampur? Because they got to know that what was their target, what is the ordnance they dropped, and Unithan has raised it very well. What was the ordnance? Where we have no clue what actually, in fact, Imran may tell us what happened in Pakistan.
General, the next question.
Thank you very much. I must congratulate Arjun for a very sober assessment of the results of the Balakot airstrikes, because many of our people have been carried away with sweeping statements like game changer, new normal, paradigm shift, crossing the Rubicon, redefined red lines, turning point, and I can go on. The question is, although you did say that you can do it again, provided you have the intelligence inputs, because in a counter-terrorism strategy, we have to do what the Israelis call mowing the grass. Mowing the grass means that you have to do these ground surgical strikes again, you have to do the airstrikes again, and you have to do other things again that Manpreet talked about, the covert part of it. So the question is, can we do this again, even if we have the 8-figure coordinates? Because now Pakistan knows that this can happen. So therefore, I'm not saying you can't do it, but the cost of that is going to be much higher. And a question for Manpreet. Manpreet, you, I think, said that we've been able to call Pakistan's nuclear bluff. I think you might like to reconsider that statement, because in the case of Pakistan, the 4 red lines that were defined by General Kidwai some time ago to that group of Italian journalists and I think there's military attrition, acute political destabilization, economic strangulation, and space. Now, none of these has been breached. So, how have we called Pakistan's nuclear bluff? That's the question. And if you, the 5-second 5-second question. Actually, it's something that nobody has touched, and which is critical to the strategic and operational perspective between India and Pakistan. That's the role of the United States. So I leave it there because they played a critical role both in allowing India to carry out the strikes and then clamping on in de-escalation. If you follow what Trump said, India is planning something big, and I have good news. So it was being calibrated and controlled. Thank you.
Thank you, General. I think the problem with Trump also is that, he may have known about it, but the thing is he says so many things, nobody believed him. So, Orko, quick question, and then I'll come to the gentleman at the back in the next round. I remember that you have a question.
I have two questions, and any of the panelists may address it. One of them have already been raised by General here, that we saw different responses coming up from the international community, particularly during the Cold War, when there was a bipolar stability, and then you saw the end of Cold War and you had US as a lone superpower managing conflict, escalation, de-escalation in South Asia. In a world which is increasingly becoming multipolar, how do you see that impacting South Asian conflict in terms of the international effect or pressures on New Delhi and Rawalpindi? The second question is, are we emphasizing too much being a public policy think tank on the public narrative? Because maybe this is something that we do. I mean, there are studies that still indicate that though national security is becoming an important, increasingly important factor, it's still nowhere near to have a determining effect on at least electoral politics insofar the Indian polity is concerned. So whether it's the incumbent government's attempt of increasing national security as an agenda of election, and whether it's mismanagement of the Balakot airstrike, I think we are looking too much into the impact of this whole episode on how that would, affect the election results.
Thank you, Orko. I'll come to you in the next round. Sandeep, would you like to start this time? And then we'll go down the table. Okay, why don't you go first?
Let me start with the issue of narrative once again, since that's come up so many times, including from Angad. I think in this age of 24/7 media, narrative becomes extremely important because it's the media that's constantly looking for breaking news. And therefore, when I mentioned the role of the media, my focus was not so much on narrative building as on introspection that the media needs to do for itself. That does it need to have real-time information at all times to be breaking that news? Is it that important for them to know exactly what's going on at one particular time when a military operation is in action? So that introspection. Do war rooms have to be built in TV studios in order to explain exactly from where the aircraft came in and where it went? Does that matter? And is that part of the narrative building that we're talking about here? And I want to just draw your attention to the Cuban Missile Crisis, a completely different media age. I understand that very much. But even then, President Kennedy had instructed his people to talk to the media to get them to understand the import of what was going on, so that they don't allow the country to be painted into a corner where you're forced into taking action that you don't want to go down the route. So therefore, that understanding of the media is what I wanted to focus on rather than the narrative building part of this whole exercise. General Mehta, sir, calling Pakistan's bluff. I did not use that terminology, but you do understand what we are saying. My sense of the situation is that what India managed to do with Balakot. Yes, we did not touch any of those thresholds that Pakistan is talking about, but nevertheless, you touched the mental threshold on many of these issues. And Pakistan's strategy of projecting itself as a quick user of nuclear weapons, that my threshold is so low, that I will not be able to fight a conventional war, I will not be able to sustain conventional action, and therefore I have no choice but to use nuclear weapons. That is the idea that got punctured through the action that happened at Balakot. Yes, it was one instance. We don't know what would have happened if this operation had sustained over a period of time. But nevertheless, that tendency of Pakistan to constantly put that nuclear weapon down your nose, I think to some extent has been blunted. On the role of US, yes, third-party mediation, extremely important. We've seen that in the past in all of the crises that have happened between India, Pakistan. And this time I have no doubt that the US played a role. In fact, I would even say China played a role. This will never come out in the public domain, perhaps, as to what kind of a restraint did China put on Pakistan in order to not let them escalate the situation beyond a point. But certainly China would have been worried, since they've built their stakedom there in that stakehood in that country. There are vulnerabilities that come with that stakehood, and China certainly would have played a role, but it will not come out very quickly into the open domain. Arka, to your question about multipolar world having an impact on South Asia, well, not all poles are going to be equally interested in what's going on in South Asia. But there will certainly be some members of that international community who will have extremely high concern about South Asia, and they will continue to. And the good thing about India at this moment is, for such a long period of time, we were wary of third-party mediation. The US was never our friend in that sense. So it was always seen as that third-party mediation would lead to a situation which would turn out to be more favorable for Pakistan than for India. But the tables have turned on that, and we are today in a situation where Pakistan is more concerned about what US mediation would mean for a crisis between India and Pakistan.
Let me go first. As far as the multipolar, the impact of multipolar pressures on any kind of conflict situation in South Asia, I think there will be pressures for the pure and simple reason, and the reason is, I think, is positive from an Indian perspective. It's because the rest of the world has such a stake in Indian economic progress and Indian growth. It would sort of there would be a stakeholder in that. And that would be a significant conflict mitigator in South Asia in the future. Because if you look at it, Pakistan is a what, $250 billion economy. India is a $2.5 trillion economy, and that asymmetry is only going to widen over the years. And obviously, the world will have a stake in some amount of stability in South Asia, because that stability in South Asia is driven by India's economic growth. So it's a positive driver, and it will certainly impinge on that. Secondly, about you talked, interesting point, about the public narrative not really being important at all when it comes to national security issues. I agree with you. Because national security discourse in India is still extremely elitist. It's concentrated in the hands of a few, and irrespective of what the cacophony in the public domain is, that narrative will not change. It's in the hands of a few, and it will continue like so for some time more. Okay? General Mehta, sir, you talked about you talked about Israel. Now the thing is, Israel is able to do what it does, number one, because it looks at any national security threat as an existential threat, number one. Number two, the gap between capability and intent is extremely small. In the Indian case, India is such a large and resilient nation that I don't think it faces any existential threat. It faces fissures and cracks to its democratic vision, and it looks at most national security threats as either a threat to its territorial sovereignty in pockets, as well as to internal fissures and cracks. But on the other hand, if one talks about executing similar strikes in the future, it will only be possible if the gap between capability and intent shrinks. And for that, I think we are a long way off. So to say that we can replicate such strikes, even if we have good intelligence, one has to be extremely circumspect. But that doesn't say that it will not do it. And that's again where I would like to go along with Sandeep when I say that there is a sense of unpredictability within the Indian strategic establishment, which I think is good. And the Indian strategic establishment is thinking more and more about the OODA loop. How can it stay inside the OODA loop of the adversary? How can it think differently? So I think in that way, that's the answer to what I have for you. And for Riser, it's basically the target was not, from my understanding of the operational picture, the target was not Adampur. I don't think the target was any big airfield.
What did they do?
In the sense, the intent was to use the H2, H4, which is the standoff weapon, against military targets in the Naushera sector.
Chinese advise them that don't touch a civilian target because the army chief and the air chief.
No, I don't. Let's not read. Let's.
They were angry. They went in by Imran Khan.
No. Let's not read so much into it. The Pakistani Air Force response was an operational response. It has standoff weapons. Probably they would have. They were intended to target the Naushera Brigade or 16 Corps targets within the 16 Corps area of responsibility, but they were warded off. And what you have to understand is that you require some steady tracking time to deliver even standoff weapons accurately. Now, when large forces engage with one another at combat at distances of 50 kilometers, you're constantly, it's like a long distance sparring match. Okay, you're constantly painting, you're breaking lock, you're turning away. So that's the reason why the weapons were used and they didn't find their target. Okay, and finally about credibility. I will only say that the very fact that the Air Force Chief has come out twice to say that we were given a mission, we've executed the mission, we've struck targets, I think is good enough for me. It may not be good enough for you, it may not be good enough for the media, but for me it's good enough that it was intent, there has been destruction of the order that was intended, or else the response would have been different.
Sandeep?
No.
You don't want to answer Angit's question regarding credibility?
No, Angad he was adding to what I said. So, in a sense,
I'll quickly come to you. The gentleman in the white shirt who's been waiting for a while right now. I'll go to Dinakar after that and I'll come to both of you.
Thank you. My name is Rakesh Sharma. My question first is to the AVM. To say that the airstrikes were not carried out earlier because they were escalatory in nature. Was this airstrike not escalatory in nature, and do we learn a lesson for future? Because in no time the Pakis had thrown their might against us, and while your answer to Commodore Ranjit Rai said that they dropped bombs which didn't mean a business, but they could have meant a business. If he used S2, S4, and we know the ranges of S2, S4, he could have taken the targets of 16 Corps zone in a much larger time frame, a much larger quantity, and we would have had much more casualties that we could have inflicted in Balakot. In this instance itself, we would have had hundreds and hundreds, because these are very large headquarters, a very large headquarters in proximity of LSE. We would have been, it would be spilt milk, and it nearly happened this way. So if I have to take lessons for tomorrow, was this strike not escalatory in nature? I would like to contest that argument. I thought it was escalatory in nature, and we scraped through by the skin of our nose. We nearly had it in 16 Corps zone, but we missed it. I mean, I would say that. And second is, this question of no casualties, it doesn't matter to us. I've heard the air chief, and a good friend of mine. It does not matter about credibility. The contest is not the credibility of the Air Force. Air Force is credible and they targeted it. I'm contesting the credibility of the INT Corps, of the INT people. Did they provide us a credible target? I mean, how do we know Balakot? We never heard of Balakot before Balakot happened. So what is the credibility of the next target that the Air Force provides us? So were there 300 people? Was it the right place? I would say the targets of what happened in Myanmar, in NSCNK, and what happened in the surgical strike 1, well, I would also contest whether they were credible targets given to us by the INT. So the point is not credibility of the armed forces, it's the credibility of the people who provide the targets to us.
Thank you. Dinakar?
a very quick observation to on the narrative thing with what Dr. Sethi mentioned and what even Sandeep said. No, on that day, 27th, especially, what Sandeep was saying in South Block, we were all clueless, roaming around, a whole bunch of defense correspondents, totally clueless. And in fact, that's what actually speaks speculation. And when you say media, we tend to generalize with just print and TV. But the point is, there's a whole bigger beast called social media, which actually feeds the TV also in many cases nowadays. All the more reason now. And every fellow is an armchair analyst, everyone says something, and that breeds in. And that day, till probably in the late evening, we had nothing. And till that time, the amount of guesswork that went on in everywhere was humongous, even on TV. And that's what actually kind of, even on, I said, war rooms on the air, the people were building bunkers on TV screens, studios. The point was, if there's information flow coming in, the room for speculation within the war rooms gets limited. In the lack of information, that goes all over the place. Just to add that.
Thanks, Dinakar. You want to go first and second?
Yes, yeah. If I may be allowed, I have two small questions from Dr. Manpreet Sethi and one question from Honorable AVM Arjun. My first question is there a cause and effect relationship between the 2019 elections and the Balakot strikes? One. And second question to Dr. Manpreet, you have put the onus of nuclear brinkmanship to Pakistan good enough. I would seek the liberty to draw your attention to the official statement by the Indian Navy in March, early March, which said that in the wake of Troopek exercise, Indian Navy deployed nuclear submarines. That after claiming non-military strike and then officially saying that there was no mobilization. So I would seek your views on that statement. And thirdly, AVM Arjun sir, since you're a fighter pilot yourself, I would seek your learned views on the unconditional repatriation of Wing Commander Abhinandan. And do you think it had a meaningful impact on how things unfolded later on? Thank you.
Next question.
Yeah, please.
So you said that the main item government of India served on the platter was unpredictability, but then all these successful ops are all about a surprise element and unpredictability. But the question is, we talked that this operation was intelligence based, but we owe a lot to Israel because yes, we do so. We exchange satellite imagery. We have a deal with Israel, wherein the Israeli satellite communicated with the Indian satellite, and that's how we were provided the targets. And this could also be the answer to his question, wherein he lays his finger on the credibility of the targets. I think you would be able to better explain it.
Well, that's news to me. This is actually material for the next movie, I guess. Okay. The Indian and Israeli, collusion to hit Balakot is terrific movie material, but it's not substantiated.
So we have.
Let's just take let's not take the speculation, but we'll take the question. So
let me just look at.
Statement, and I mentioned it myself to say that where I saw the risk of manipulation of war by India, where India did not shy away from making that statement, which it has never done in the past. So, I mean, I acknowledge the fact that that statement was made by the Indian Navy. We've all read it to understand that this happened. And there were sort of reasons as to why India was doing that. And that's the kind of new playbook that is coming into play.
And Sharma sir, I will just respond to about your escalatory issue. Of course, if you recollect, I did mention during my talk that the escalatory dimension is that air power also has this potential to escalate and then de-escalate. So whether the airstrikes were escalatory, I wouldn't say they were not escalatory, but they de-escalated the situation subsequently. So escalation and de-escalation in contemporary warfare is entirely situational and contextual. So no longer can we attach tags of being escalatory, non-escalatory, easier to handle. So it was escalatory, and then it was followed by de-escalation. And I will give you an example of Kargil also. The entry of air power was expected to be escalatory. The Pakistan Air Force did not respond because we stayed on our side of the LC. And then subsequently, I think air power played some role in de-escalation also in Kargil. So point taken, sir, but I think it's in grey. Secondly, about intelligence, sir, I would not like to sort of comment on intelligence because I'm not really an intelligence man. I'm an air power, primarily an air power guy, and so you said that it was an intelligence-driven operation, and the Air Force went by the intelligence given, and by all by all signals that come out, the intelligence wasn't really wrong.
Sandeep, do you have anything to add?
I don't know, was that a question for me? Unpredictability when you said that?
No, I was saying that all the successful operations have the element of surprise and unpredictability.
So ma'am, I made that statement in the context of the fact that, since 1990, there had not been any conventional or sub-conventional response from the Indian state, despite there being a lot of provocation from 1993, 2006, 8. So this was the first time that you actually saw the Indian state authorizing the use of force in these kind of operations in 2016 and now in 2019. So that's how the element of unpredictability was introduced by the Indian government. That's what I meant to say.
I just forgot to answer the question about Abhinandan's release. Well, I would say that Pakistan had no choice but to release Abhinandan in the time frame that they did, keeping in mind that what was done to Nachiketa in Kargil was still fresh in everyone's mind, and as compared to Kargil 1999 to post Balakot 2019, I think a world of difference in terms of comprehensive national power, in terms of the kind of global support for India's operations. So I think Pakistan really had no choice but to release Abhinandan in the time frame that they did. So I don't think there was any great altruistic or gestural impact of the release of Abhinandan on the post-conflict, on the post-operative scenario.
The gentleman in the maroon shirt.
Pallav Bagla, Science Editor, NDTV. Sandeep, you mentioned about offensive defense, and we spoke about Balakot. Bringing it forward, you saw Mission Shakti. You think it's a carry forward of offensive defense? And where do we go from here?
No, I don't know. I wish I knew the answer to that. But Pallav, the short answer is that, Mission Shakti was completely different. It's just a demonstration of a certain capability. And I don't believe that was anything more than a technology demonstrator. You know more about this than I do. I think it's just a one-off test to demonstrate capability. And I'm unsure whether it's actually going to become a full-fledged anti-satellite program, because the kind of resources you know better than anyone else, the kind of resources that will take, the kind of radars and missiles and infrastructure on the ground will... Actually, the priority is ballistic missile defense and not so much ASAT capability. So I guess it's just one of those things.
Maybe Manpreet wants to add something?
I think, Pallav, one can connect any number of dots to paint the picture that you want to paint. I wouldn't say it's coming directly from what was happening in Balakot that it led to the ASAT test. These, as you understand very well, are developments that happen over a period of time. The capability is built up, and then, as he said, the intent has to, match with the capability at some point for it to be demonstrated. So I'm not surprised that it happened at this time. And as I was mentioning to someone, apart from the focus on the domestic conditions which might have led to the ASAT test, I think internationally this was the best time for India to show its hand on the ASAT. It's one of the demonstrations of capability that India has undertaken. We'll see what the ramifications are in terms of global governance, rules, etc. coming into place. But India has shown a deterrent value of the capability that it has. I think we don't need to read too much beyond that right now into the ASAT test. Do we have another round of questions?
One last round of questions. The lady at the back, in the second row.
Thank you. I'd just like to come back to the question of unpredictability and the term of the answer of the Indian authorities. But don't you think that...
Speak louder.
Sorry. I wanted to go back to the concept of unpredictability of the answer by the Indian authorities. Don't you think that this precise answer created some expectations for the next attack? And if yes, what is the long-term perspective? How does India, for the next attacks, if indeed Balakot was not the solution for terrorism, what is the perspective for India to manage the escalation. Thank you.
Any other questions? Since there are no other questions, I'm just going to ask a provocative question to stir the pot a bit for all the panelists. We've been discussing the airstrikes quite a bit, but the day after, when the large package that was detected coming in from Pakistan, we did lose a MiG-21. Now, if reports are to be believed, we've also lost a Mi-17 helicopter, which was shot down due to friendly fire, and we lost a couple of lives. Do you think that these losses, we did not come out without any casualties, defending against that responsive attack? Do you think that has sort of dented the political messaging of the airstrike in India?
Absolutely. I would say casualties are expected. Any professional force will expect. Will accept casualties. So to say that these casualties in any way blunted or dented the operational impact, no, I don't think so. I don't think they've sort of dented. Is there scope for reflection, and is there scope for lessons learned? Of course there is. Every operation has lessons learned. Every operation has lessons to be learned.
I'm now going to go to all our panelists for closing remarks. So if you just take 2 minutes to wrap up and respond to any other questions that you feel you haven't responded to, and answer the last question. Sandeep.
Unpredictably, ma'am, you asked that question. Was it something what I didn't quite get the question? You said unpredictability. Where it's going to lead to? Is it?
I guess there are the two dimensions. You said that you thought that this answer was actually kind of unpredictable, that India was showing some unpredictability in terms of answer. So I was maybe questioning this in terms of, did India not create expectations in terms of response for the next attack? And if yes, meaning maybe military response to further attacks, and maybe in a proportionate way, how does India manage the next answer and maybe the escalatory ladder? Thank you.
So to quickly recap, I think the essence of the question is there a political expectation that India has to respond, if not with airstrikes, at least some sort of surgical strikes, every time that there is a terrorist attack, against a military target or against civilian targets?
I don't think there is any such expectation. I don't think there's any such expectation for the pure and simple reason that you ask, how does India respond to future terrorist attacks? I mentioned that in my presentation, that the only way in which one can sort of protect oneself is by hardening Indian society. You have to harden the Indian security establishment, you have to harden society, and exactly in the manner in which many of the countries in the West are tackling with the threat of terrorism, I think India has to go down exactly in that same line. And I don't think there are any set pattern expectations of the Indian government to respond exactly in a similar manner. So the element of unpredictability has to continue.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I think unpredictability, it's not necessary that it's cast in stone that every time there is an attack of this nature, it will be followed by a retaliation, a military retaliation. It could well be just diplomatic for the next, if there is a future attack, and we know there would be many more. One is not enough to, deter the deep state. So if there is, in the event of a future attack, the government of the day might actually decide to just, explore the diplomatic option as was done in the past.
Can we move to closing remarks? Just 2 minutes each. Thank you.
So let me start also with my thoughts on unpredictability. And I think the very idea of unpredictability is that one doesn't know what that set pattern is going to be in the future. So it will be unpredictable in terms of whether it calls for a military action or it calls for any other kinds of actions. And there were 4 of them that I mentioned to you, which remain within the realm of possibility of what India would do. Certainly, I think we've all agreed on the fact that even the Balakot airstrikes, for whatever they achieved, will not be able to stop terrorism. That is something that can only happen when there is a change of heart and change of strategy, strategic calculus of Pakistan. They have to make up their mind on how long they want to continue terrorism, and India will have to continue to, one, harden itself militarily, diplomatically, do everything that it can. Plus, look at all the options which are available when the time comes for in that crisis situation. The US has been in Afghanistan for 17 years. They haven't been able to finish terrorism. So there's no hope that we will be able to do it with one airstrike or surgical strike that we did in the past. So till it continues, the risk will also be there. And I think this is something that's not lost on India. For whatever, macho element of the strategy that India has shown this time, it does understand that there are risks involved in what is happening. So we are not fooling ourselves into believing that what India does not carry risks. But the onus of bearing that risk also lies on the party that actually instigates you into that crisis. I also go along with the thought that the lady mentioned, that every subsequent crisis will be more difficult, because bringing in the surprise element in terms of the response that is needed, and also finding the right instruments to carry out that action will lead to a lot of thinking which will be out of the box. So every subsequent crisis will become more and more difficult. Tempering domestic audience expectations, I think, will be a problem, because each time the people will believe that something more is needed in terms of punishing, in terms of making an impact on the other side. So it will be a beast which will be difficult to manage, with the narrative which is necessary for the media, which is the social platform being, the role that it plays in today's times. So we've not in any way seen the end of the story, and things are only going to be more difficult in the future unless Pakistan realizes the dangers that it is building up for itself and for the region. Unfortunately, there are no bilateral mechanisms which are at work in terms of de-escalation. So my view was that with Wing Commander Abhinandan became a very fortunate a ploy for Prime Minister Imran Khan to use in order to do de-escalation. Had he not fallen on the other side of the fence, we don't know how de-escalation would have happened. So escalation is always going to be easy. De-escalation strategies, I don't think we've thought through as to how you would do it, which is why the right instrument of power that needs to be used. As the AVM mentioned, air power gives you that benefit of quick escalation and quick de-escalation as well. Unlike forces on ground, once they're engaged, you can't disengage them. You can't de-escalate without declaring either victory or defeat in some form. So therefore, a choice of instruments will have to be thought through carefully. Yes, we had not heard of Balakot earlier, but every time something like this comes up, new words and new ways of exercising military power will be seen in the future. Thank you.
Is there, I call this a less than war. I call this a less than war situation. The overall is an imbroglio. Pakistan and India continue to be in a vicious circle, wherein one doesn't see exit. And is there an exit strategy? Of course, there is an exit strategy, and that exit strategy primarily depends on the ability of the Pakistani deep state to desist from sort of using terror as an instrument of state policy. And the second cog in the wheel is also China. I mean to say, China has a very important role to play in ceasing to use the Pakistani deep state as a way of keeping the Indian strategic establishment under pressure. So I think both the Pakistani deep state and China have a role to play in sort of breaking out of this imbroglio that currently exists. The Indian Air Force is, poised for a refurbishment. I think adequate amount of importance needs to be given to a multispectral acquisition of assets in order to sort of ensure that it's a cutting-edge service that can be a tool of statecraft in the years ahead. Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Yeah. So my two summing up points is one, of course, what my two panelists mentioned, the fact that the infrastructure of terrorism that exists in Pakistan, as long as it exists there, we will always have Pulwamas, which will be followed by Balakots, and this entire vicious cycle of terror and retaliation is going to continue. So till the time that we don't find a long-lasting solution for this, as General Mehta mentioned, maybe mowing the grass is one option, but obviously there's other things that we could consider, like bringing comprehensive national power to bear on this problem. And I think as the years go by, it's going to become increasingly difficult for Pakistan to exercise terror as an instrument of state policy. We've already seen that happening, the kind of chorus in the world, the way Pakistan was actually kind of in a corner after Pulwama, and even after Balakot, it didn't find a lot of sympathetic ears to its statements. So that is going to be a problem for them. But then the introduction of China, as Air Marshal Subramaniam mentioned, that is going to be another factor. We really don't know how, when CPAC comes in the way that it's envisaged in the years ahead, how it's going to complicate our responses. Will a Balakot kind of option work when there are large numbers of PLA personnel on the ground, or Chinese military infrastructure and civil infrastructure in Pakistan? How are we going to handle that? That's going to be one major area of concern. And of course, the other thing is the importance of communication in this whole episode. That was the weak link. If you ask me, the fact that we could not communicate as effectively and as rapidly as the situation unfolded on those two critical days, on February 26th and February 27th, and this situation is going to get worse with smartphone penetration. We are at 40% now, and as the years go by, we're looking at almost every Indian having a smartphone and therefore becoming a journalist in some senses. So we're looking at as what the Air Force calls a dense ECM environment when it comes to media and communication. It's very important for us to cut through the clutter and get our act on media ASAP. That's my thanks.
Thanks, Sandeep. Just quickly, I don't know whether we've managed to lift the fog of war, so to speak, but I think we all agree there's still a whole number of unknowns and unpredictability in this. I think there's agreement around the table to a different degree that I think the communications post-operations could have been managed a little better, and maybe there are lessons to be drawn if there are future operations like this. I'd like you to join me in thanking our panelists for taking all these questions and having a provocative discussion.